at -40 degrees on a frozen night. When Sergeant William Harrison looked at that photograph in his pocket, he didn't yet know that only 9 out of 47 men would survive. But what he really didn't know was that the decision he would make that night would become a secret he'd carry for 40 years. What happened at the Chosin Reservoir made it into Pentagon reports. Medals were awarded, heroism stories were told. But what Harrison did on that frozen night wasn't in any report. Don't forget to subscribe. From the Korean War to Vietnam, we research and share untold true veteran stories for you. It was November 1950. Harrison was 28 years old, and a sergeant in the 1st Marine Division. He came from Ohio, from a small town. Before coming to war, he worked in a factory. He was married with a 3-year-old son. In the photograph he carried in his pocket, his wife Sarah and his son Billy were smiling. He looked at that photograph every day, at every shift change, every meal break, every quiet moment. Korea Alul Ayanda Gelmishlerdi. The first few weeks weren't cold. It was even hot. But when November came, everything changed. The temperature dropped rapidly. They saw -30, then -40. The freezing wind cut their faces. Breathing became painful. Weapons froze. Fingers went numb. The Chosin Reservoir was in the mountainous region of North Korea. The order given to the Marines was clear. Advance, break enemy lines, reach the Chinese border. But the commanders hadn't accounted for one thing. The Chinese People's Liberation Army had already crossed the border. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were hiding in the mountains. It started on the night of November 27th. Harrison's squad was positioned on a hillside slope. They had set up small tents, trying to light fires. But the wind extinguished everything. The cold penetrated to the bones. Some men couldn't sleep, couldn't stop shivering. Harrison gave his blanket to a young private. Private Jenkins was 19 years old. He hadn't even started shaving yet. Around midnight the first sounds came from a distance. Horn sounds, whistle sounds. The Chinese were launching their attack. But nobody knew how many they were. In the darkness there were only sounds. Shouts, running footsteps, then gunfire. Harrison immediately went on alert and woke his squad. Everyone rushed to positions. They checked their weapons, and some had frozen barrels. They tried to thaw them, but there was no time because the first wave was coming. Hundreds of soldiers were running down from the hill. Maybe 1,000, maybe more. In the darkness, they couldn't be counted. Harrison gave his order to hold fire and let them get closer because they couldn't waste ammunition. Every bullet was precious. They opened fire at 50 meters and muzzle flashes lit up the night. The first wave stopped, but the second wave came. Then the third. Harrison's squad was firing, reloading, firing again. Hands were freezing, but they couldn't stop. It lasted until morning as the Chinese retreated, then attacked again. Harrison counted his ammunition and realized it was running low. He called for help on the radio but got no response. Either the radio was broken or headquarters couldn't respond because there were hundreds of squads in the same situation all around. When day broke, the scene was horrific. There were bodies on the hill, frozen solid. Chinese soldiers, some still frozen in attack position. 3 men from Harrison's squad were missing. The wounded count was 12, but it wasn't over yet because the second attack came in the afternoon. This time more organized, more powerful. Harrison understood the encirclement was tightening. The order came to retreat, but how would they withdraw? There were wounded, ammunition was gone. Most vehicles were frozen. Harrison made his decision that they would carry the wounded. Every able-bodied soldier would look after one wounded man. They would walk 10 kilometers south to the main camp. But those 10 kilometers were like hell. When they set out, it was snowing, and the wind had picked up. Visibility was 20 meters. Harrison walked in front with his squad behind him. They were carrying the wounded, some on stretchers, and some on their backs. Private Jenkins had been shot in the leg, so Harrison took him on his own back. In the first hour they covered 2 kilometers, which was too slow, but there was no other choice. Gunfire sounds came from behind them as the Chinese were following, and they weren't far. In the second hour the snowstorm intensified, and they could no longer see the path. The compass had frozen, So Harrison tried to find direction by looking at the stars, but clouds had covered the sky. In the third hour, they suffered their first loss, when Corporal Martinez froze to death. He fell while walking and couldn't get up. Harrison tried to stop it, but it was too late. Martinez's eyes were open, but he was frozen. Harrison took his dog tag, and they continued because they couldn't carry his body. The weight was too much. In the fourth hour, Private Jenkins died on Harrison's back. Harrison didn't even feel it, and only noticed when the weight lightened. Jenkins' body had stiffened. So Harrison lowered him to the ground and took his dog tag. He took out the photograph from Jenkins' pocket. It was a photo of his fiancée, and Harrison took that too because he would get it to his family. In the fifth hour, darkness fell, as night was coming. They found a cave that was small and narrow, but they were sheltered from the wind. They went inside, and 9 men remained. 9 out of 47. The others had either died or were lost. They couldn't light a fire in the cave because the smoke would be visible, and the Chinese would find them. They tried to warm up by huddling together. Harrison checked the wounded, and 3 were in bad condition. Blood loss was severe, but there were no bandages left. Around midnight, he heard a sound from outside the cave. Footsteps. Slow, heavy steps. Was it a Chinese patrol? Harrison pulled out his weapon. He had 3 bullets left. He signaled to the other men to be quiet. The sounds approached, then stopped. A shadow appeared at the cave entrance. Harrison held his breath and was ready to pull the trigger, but the shadow didn't enter. It left something and went away. Harrison waited 5 minutes, then 10 minutes. No sound came. He slowly crawled to the entrance and looked outside. Nobody was there, but there was something on the ground. A package wrapped in cloth. Harrison took the package and brought it inside. He opened it, and there was rice inside. Dry rice, about ½ kilogram, and a small lighter, metal, worn but working. He looked at his squad. Everyone was hungry. They hadn't eaten in 2 days. But where had this rice come from? Who had left it? Harrison went outside again. And there were footprints in the snow. He followed them about 50 meters. Then he saw a man lying on the ground. Chinese uniform. He was wounded with blood flowing from his leg. He was about to freeze. Harrison approached and aimed his weapon. The man opened his eyes, showing a young face, maybe 20 years old. He was scared but had given up. He was looking at Harrison and tried to speak, but no sound came out. Harrison thought about how this man was the enemy, but he was wounded and dying. Had he left the rice? Why? The man pointed to his pocket, so Harrison approached without lowering his weapon. He reached into the man's pocket and pulled out a photograph, showing an elderly woman and a small child. It could be the man's mother and brother. Harrison looked at the photograph in his own pocket, showing Sarah and Billy. Then at the Chinese soldier's photograph, 2 photographs, 2 families, 2 sides, but the same story. He had to make a decision. He could leave this man and go. He would die anyway, and nobody would know. But he had left the rice and saved Harrison's squad. Maybe it wasn't intentional. Maybe he had just left it to hide himself, but the result didn't change. Harrison grabbed the man's arm and tried to lift him. He was heavy. The man resisted, and there was shock in the Chinese soldier's eyes. He didn't understand why his enemy was saving him. Harrison spoke in English, telling him to come with him. The man didn't understand the words, but understood from the tone. Harrison put him on his back and returned to the cave. When his squad saw him, they were shocked. Sergeant Miller jumped to his feet, asking what Harrison was doing, and pointing out that this man was the enemy. Harrison didn't answer. He lowered the man to the ground and checked the wound on his leg. The bullet had exited, and he needed to clean it. He used his last clean cloth and bandaged it. The man groaned in pain, but Harrison continued. Miller asked again, insisting this was madness because this man came to kill them. Harrison finally spoke, explaining that this man left the rice and saved their lives, so now he was saving him. The squad fell silent. They looked at the rice, then at the Chinese soldier, then at Harrison. Nobody objected. Harrison started cooking the rice and lit a small fire with the lighter deep in the cave where little smoke came out. He cooked the rice with snow, and it was enough for 9 men and 1 Chinese soldier. They stayed there through the night. The Chinese soldier slept as the fire died down. Harrison kept watch and didn't sleep all night. He was thinking about whether he could explain this decision and whether his commanders would understand or his squad would consider it betrayal. But something else was occupying his mind. That photograph. The Chinese soldier's photograph. The woman in it, probably his mother, had the same look in her eyes as Sarah, showing worry, hope, and prayer. That child, probably his brother, had the same innocence as Billy. Harrison realized something that night. The man lying in that cave wasn't just an enemy soldier. He was a son, maybe a brother, maybe a father, just like himself. The uniform was different, the language was different, but the humanity was the same. Morning came, and the Chinese soldier woke up. He looked around and saw American soldiers, which made him panic. He tried to get up, but his leg wouldn't allow it. Harrison approached and gave him water. The soldier drank and looked at Harrison with confused eyes. Harrison made his decision that he would take this man with them to the main camp where medics would treat him. He would become a prisoner of war. Yes, but he would live. He could return to his mother one day, to his brother. Sergeant Miller objected, pointing out they could barely carry their own wounded and asking how they would carry an enemy soldier. Harrison's response was firm, stating they would carry him and that it was an order. The squad prepared to move. They made a simple stretcher for the Chinese soldier with 2 men carrying him and taking turns. Harrison distributed the remaining rice and everyone ate a little, which gave them strength. They set out at dawn. The storm had passed and visibility was better, but the cold was still brutal at -40 degrees with cutting wind. They walked slowly, very slowly, and every step was torture. The wounded were moaning. The Chinese soldier was silent, watching Harrison and trying to understand. In the second hour of the march, they heard sounds behind them. Voices. Chinese voices. A patrol was following them, and they were close. Harrison ordered them to move faster. But how could they go faster when they were carrying wounded and were exhausted, not having slept in 2 days? Harrison made another decision, that he would stay back and delay the patrol to give his squad time. Miller understood immediately and protested that they wouldn't leave him, but Harrison insisted it was an order, telling the sergeant to take the squad and get to camp while he would catch up. Miller knew he couldn't argue. Harrison was the commander and the order was clear, but his eyes showed he understood this might be the last time they saw each other. Harrison gave Miller the dog tags from Martinez, Jenkins, and the others. He also gave him the photographs, instructing him to get these to their families. The squad moved on while Harrison stayed. He found a position behind rocks with good cover. He had 3 bullets and would make them count. The Chinese patrol appeared with 8 to 10 men, following the tracks. Harrison waited and let them get closer. 50 meters, 40 meters, 30 meters, he fired the first shot, and 1 soldier fell. The patrol scattered, took cover, and returned fire. Bullets hit the rocks. Harrison ducked and waited. He fired the second shot, and another soldier fell. The patrol was more cautious now, advancing slowly and using cover. Harrison had 1 bullet left, 1 bullet and 8 soldiers. The mathematics wasn't in his favor, but he had bought time. His squad was far now and could reach camp. He aimed the last bullet, but didn't fire because something unexpected happened. The Chinese patrol stopped as their commander raised his hand and called out something in Chinese. Harrison didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. It wasn't aggressive, it was questioning. Then 1 soldier came forward, unarmed, with his hands raised, walking slowly toward Harrison. Harrison aimed but didn't fire. The soldier stopped 10 meters away and spoke in broken English, telling him they saw him save and carry the soldier. Harrison was shocked because they had seen him carrying the wounded Chinese soldier, and they knew. The soldier continued explaining that Harrison was a good man and should go, that they would not follow. Harrison didn't believe it at first, wondering if this was a trap, but the soldier's face was sincere. He was young, maybe younger than the wounded soldier in the cave. Harrison slowly stood up with weapons still ready. The Chinese soldiers didn't move as their commander nodded in a gesture of respect. Harrison started walking backwards slowly. The Chinese patrol watched and nobody fired. Harrison turned and started running. Behind him, no gunfire came. He ran for an hour and caught up with his squad. Miller saw him and couldn't believe it, asking how he got away. Harrison didn't explain because he couldn't. He didn't understand it himself. Mercy in the middle of war. Humanity in the middle of hell. It wasn't supposed to be possible, but it had happened. They reached the main camp before evening. The medics took the wounded and the Chinese soldier was also treated. Harrison reported to his commander and told the story about the march, the losses, the cave, and the rice. But he didn't tell about the Chinese soldier. He said they found him wounded on the road and he thought he might have valuable intelligence. The commander accepted the explanation, and there was no investigation. Too much was happening. Chosin was hell and everyone was trying to survive. The Chinese soldier recovered and became a prisoner of war. He was taken to a POW camp. Harrison never saw him again, never learned his name, never learned if he returned home. But Harrison kept the photograph showing that elderly woman and little boy. He kept it in his pocket next to Sarah and Billy's photograph. Two families, two sides, same love. Years passed, and Harrison returned home in 1951. He received a medal for his actions at Chosin. The newspapers wrote about his heroism and his town celebrated, but Harrison said nothing because he couldn't tell the real story. He worked at the factory again, raised his son, and lived a quiet life. But every November 27th he would remember that frozen night, that cave, that decision. He never told anyone, not Sarah, not Billy, not his comrades. It was his secret, his burden, because he didn't know if he had done the right thing. Had he betrayed his country by saving an enemy soldier, or had he honored his humanity? The years turned into decades as the 1960s passed, then the 70s, then the 80s. Harrison grew old. His hair turned white and his back bent, but he still carried those photographs in his wallet. Sarah had passed away in 1985. Billy had grown up, become a teacher, and had his own children. In 1990 something happened. Harrison received a letter from South Korea. The envelope had Chinese writing on it. Inside was a letter in English, written carefully with some mistakes but understandable. The letter explained that the writer's name was Chen Wei, and in 1950, Harrison had saved his life in Chosin, in the cave, by carrying him and giving him food and taking him to the American camp. Chen said he never forgot and couldn't forget because Harrison showed him that even in war humanity exists and that enemies can be brothers. Chen explained he returned to China in 1953 through prisoner exchange and found his mother and brother alive, and because of Harrison he saw them again. Chen wrote that he wanted to write earlier but couldn't, because China was closed and letters didn't go out, but now the world was changing and borders were opening, so he could finally say thank you. He explained he was old now at 60 years old and had a son named Harrison because Chen named him after the sergeant who gave him life, and his son has life because of Harrison. Chen wrote that he didn't know if Harrison remembered him and maybe Harrison saved many lives so maybe his wasn't important, but for Chen Harrison was a hero not because he fought, but because he chose mercy. The letter concluded by explaining that if it reached Harrison, he should know that night in the cave, Harrison didn't just save one soldier, but saved a son, a brother, a future father, and saved a family. Chen thanked him from the bottom of his heart. With the letter was a photograph showing an elderly Chinese man standing with a young man, father and son. The elderly man's face was aged, but Harrison recognized the eyes, those same eyes from 40 years ago that were scared, confused, and grateful. Harrison read the letter 3 times, then 4. His hands were shaking as tears were streaming down his face. For 40 years he had wondered. For 40 years he had questioned. For 40 years he had carried the guilt. But now he knew he had made the right choice. That frozen night in that cave he had chosen humanity over duty, mercy over hate, and life over death. He wrote back and told his story about Sarah and Billy, about his life, about how that night had haunted him, and about how grateful he was to finally know. They exchanged letters for 3 years, Harrison and Chen, 2 old soldiers, 2 former enemies, 2 friends. In 1993, Chen wrote that he was coming to America and wanted to meet Harrison face to face. Harrison couldn't believe it. After 43 years they would meet again. The cave, the rice, the mercy, would come full circle. They met in San Francisco at the airport. Harrison was 71 years old, and Chen was 63. They saw each other, two elderly men walking slowly toward each other. Then they embraced. They didn't speak at first because words weren't necessary. They just held each other, crying, laughing, remembering. Two soldiers who should have been enemies but became brothers through one act of mercy on a frozen night. Chen stayed in America for 2 weeks, and every day he and Harrison talked. They shared stories about their lives, their families, their memories. Chen told Harrison about his life in China, about the hard years after the war, about raising his son Harrison, about his grandchildren. Harrison told Chen about Ohio, about working at the factory, about watching Billy grow up, about losing Sarah. On the last day before Chen returned to China, they went to the National Cemetery together. They stood before the memorial wall where the names of fallen soldiers were engraved. Harrison found Martinez's name, then Jenkins' name, then the others from his squad who didn't make it home from Chosin. Chen bowed deeply before each name, a gesture of respect and gratitude. These men had died so others could live, and Chen's life was part of that legacy. Harrison took out the 2 photographs he still carried. His family and Chen's family. He showed them to Chen, explaining he had kept them together all these years, because they reminded him of what was truly important, not the uniforms or the flags or the orders, but the people behind them, the families waiting at home, the humanity that connects all of us. Chen nodded, understanding completely, because he had carried the same truth in his heart for 43 years. Before Chen left, he gave Harrison a gift. It was a small jade pendant, carved in the shape of a crane, a symbol of longevity and peace in Chinese culture. Chen explained that in Chinese tradition, the crane represents living a long life with honor and wisdom, and he wanted Harrison to have this because Harrison had given him the gift of life itself. Harrison accepted it with trembling hands and promised to treasure it always. In return, Harrison gave Chen something he had kept since that night in the cave, the military lighter that Chen had left with the rice. Chen's eyes widened in recognition as he held it, this small piece of metal that had saved lives by providing warmth and hope in the darkest moment. They said goodbye at the airport. Chen returned to China and Harrison returned to Ohio, but they continued writing letters, now more frequently, sharing the small details of daily life that meant so much. Chen sent photographs of his grandchildren, and Harrison sent photographs of Billy's children. 2 families connected across the world by one night of mercy. Harrison lived until 1997. He was 75 years old when he passed away peacefully in his sleep. At his funeral, Billy stood before the gathered mourners and told a story that his father had finally shared with him in his last days. The story of the cave, the rice, the Chinese soldier, and the decision that had defined his father's life. Billy explained that his father had carried the burden of that secret for so long, wondering if he had betrayed his duty, until the letter came in 1990, and he finally understood that mercy was never a betrayal, that choosing humanity was always the right decision, no matter what the orders said or what the war demanded. Billy held up the jade crane pendant and the military lighter, explaining these 2 objects represented the bridge between enemies that his father had built with one act of compassion on a frozen Korean hillside. He read excerpts from Chen's letters, describing how Harrison's mercy had rippled through time, giving Chen a life, giving Chen's son Harrison life, giving Chen's grandchildren life, creating an entire family tree that existed because one American sergeant chose to see the human being behind the enemy uniform. Chen learned of Harrison's death through a letter from Billy. He was devastated but not surprised. They were both old men and time was catching up. Chen wrote back to Billy expressing his sorrow and gratitude, explaining that Harrison was his American father, the man who gave him a second birth in that cave. Chen requested that when his time came he wanted to be buried with the military lighter, the symbol of warmth and mercy that had saved him. In 2003, Chen Wei passed away in Beijing at the age of 73. His son Harrison Chen fulfilled his father's wish and placed the old military lighter in his father's coffin. At the funeral, Harrison Chen told his own children about the American sergeant their grandfather never forgot, about the frozen night in Chosin, about mercy in the middle of war. He explained that his name carried the legacy of two men, one Chinese and one American, connected by an act of humanity that transcended borders in politics and conflict. Billy and Harrison Chen began corresponding and eventually met in 2005 in Seoul, South Korea, on the 55th anniversary of the Battle of Chosin Reservoir. They stood together at the memorial, two sons honoring their father's friendship. They placed flowers and bowed their heads in silence, remembering the sacrifice of all those who fought and died, but also celebrating the story of mercy and humanity that emerged from that frozen hell. The story of Sergeant William Harrison and Chen Wei remained largely unknown for decades, a private truth shared between two families. But in 2010, Billy published a book titled The Cave at Chosin that told his father's story in full. The book included the letters between Harrison and Chen, the photographs, and the reflections on war, mercy, and humanity. It became a quiet bestseller, not because of dramatic battle scenes, but because of its simple truth about choosing compassion even when surrounded by violence. Veterans from the Korean War read the book, and many wrote to Billy, sharing their own stories of mercy and regret, of decisions made in the chaos of combat that haunted them for decades. Some had shown mercy, and wondered if they had betrayed their duty. Others had followed orders without question, and wondered if they should have chosen differently. Billy responded to every letter, sharing his father's belief that there was no single right answer, but that questioning and remembering and seeking humanity was itself an act of honor. The book reached South Korea and China, where it was translated and quietly circulated despite political sensitivities. Young people in both countries read about Harrison and Chen, about two enemies who became brothers, about war that couldn't destroy the fundamental human connection. In an era of continued tension between nations, the story offered a different narrative, a reminder that the soldiers on both sides were human beings with families and hopes and fears. In 2015, on the 65th anniversary of Chosin, a special ceremony was held at the Chosin Few Memorial. Billy was 67 years old, and Harrison Chen was 54. They stood together before the memorial and unveiled a small plaque that told the story of Sergeant William Harrison and the Chinese soldier he saved. The plaque explained this was not a story of betrayal, but of the highest form of loyalty. Loyalty to humanity itself. Loyalty to the belief that even in war there must be room for mercy. Military officials from both the United States and South Korea attended the ceremony. There was initial resistance to honoring an act that seemed to violate the clear lines of war. But eventually the military leadership recognized that Harrison's actions represented the best of military values, the protection of life and the courage to make difficult moral choices under impossible circumstances. The plaque read, "In memory of Sergeant William Harrison, 1st Marine Division, who in the frozen hell of Chosin Reservoir in November 1950 chose mercy over hate, demonstrating that true courage includes compassion for all human life, even the enemies." The jade crane pendant that Chen gave Harrison and the military lighter that Harrison returned to Chen became symbolic artifacts. The pendant was donated to the Korean War Memorial Museum, where it sits in a display case alongside Harrison's medals and the letters between the two men. The lighter, buried with Chen, was represented in the display by a detailed replica. Visitors to the museum, both American and Asian, stop before this display and read the story. Many are moved to tears. Parents explain to children that war is not simple, that humanity persists even in the darkest moments, that mercy is not weakness, but the highest form of strength. Teachers in both America and Asia began using the story in classrooms to discuss ethics, war, and cross-cultural understanding. Students debated Harrison's decision, with some arguing he betrayed his duty and others arguing he fulfilled a higher duty. These debates had no clear resolution, but they forced young people to think deeply about moral complexity, about the difference between following orders and following conscience, about when rules must be questioned and when mercy must override protocol. The story influenced military training programs as well. At West Point and Annapolis, cadets studied the case of Harrison and Chen as part of their ethics curriculum. Instructors used it to explore the tension between mission objectives and humanitarian concerns, between tactical decisions and moral imperatives. The case had no right answer, which made it valuable for training officers who would face similar ambiguities in their own service. The lesson was not what Harrison should have done, but rather how to think through impossible choices with both strategic thinking and human compassion. Billy passed away in 2020, at age 72. Harrison Chen spoke at his funeral, explaining that Billy had become like a brother to him, that their father's friendship had created a bond that transcended generations. Harrison Chen vowed to continue sharing the story with his own grandchildren, ensuring that the legacy of mercy and humanity would pass to yet another generation. He explained that in a world increasingly divided by nationalism and conflict, the story of two enemies who became brothers was more relevant than ever. Today, the story of the cave at Chosin lives on through multiple channels. The book continues to sell steadily, finding new readers each year. A documentary was made in 2018, featuring interviews with Harrison Chen, Billy's family, and military historians, who analyzed the incident. The documentary was shown at film festivals and military academies, sparking discussions about the nature of heroism and the complexity of war. Online forums and social media communities dedicated to military history regularly discuss the story, debating Harrison's choice and sharing their own perspectives on mercy in combat. What makes the story endure is not its uniqueness, but its universality. Every war has moments like this, decisions made in the chaos where humanity either survives or dies. Harrison's story survived because he chose to act on his compassion despite the risk, and because decades later that choice was validated by the man whose life he saved. The story proves that mercy is not forgotten, that humanity recognized and honored creates bonds stronger than the politics that divide nations. The two photographs that Harrison carried, his family and Chen's family, now sit side by side in the Memorial Museum display. They are faded and worn, creased from being carried in a pocket through decades of life. But the faces still show clearly. Sarah and Billy, the elderly Chinese woman and the small boy. Two families connected by war, by mercy, by the recognition that behind every uniform is a human being with people who love them and wait for them to come home. Sergeant William Harrison went to Chosin Reservoir as a soldier following orders. He returned as a man who understood that the highest orders come from conscience, that true courage includes the courage to show mercy, and that humanity persists even in frozen hell. He carried the burden of his secret decision for 40 years until a letter from across the world told him what he needed to hear, that choosing life over death, mercy over hate, and humanity over duty was not betrayal, but the purest form of honor. That frozen night in that cave, with 3 bullets and 8 enemies, with every reason to leave the wounded Chinese soldier to die, Harrison chose differently. And that choice echoed through decades, through 2 families, through 2 nations, through generations of people who hear the story. And remember that even in the darkest moments we have the power to choose mercy, we have the power to choose humanity, we have the power to save not just lives but the hope that goodness can survive even in hell.